Good afternoon from Nairobi, and thank you for tuning in to host this panel at the 10th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues. Thank you to the Policy Center for the New South for the invitation to moderate this conversation. It's always a pleasure. And I am Andres Kipani. I am the East and Central Africa Bureau Chief with the Financial Times. And today we'll be discussing multilateralism and the construction of a new world order. I mean, there are hopes, let's say, after a few years of quite a stark retrenchment, that the world is tilting back towards some sort of multilateralism. I mean, recent weeks alone were just packed with very high-profile gatherings like the COP26 in Glasgow and the G20 in Rome. And we saw there that countries that are still sticking to relative isolationism, Brazil, my previous home, springs to mind. It was clear in these two meetings, particularly in the G20, during which Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro was seen as an outcast and being sort of like sidelined. And to discuss this and more and what's going on, what may happen, the role of the G20, the UN, and this new sort of world order, I had the pleasure to start a chat with Yunus Abuyub, who is the director of the Governance and State Building Division for the MENA region at the United Nations, and Paolo Magri, who is the Executive Vice President and Director of the Italian Institute for International and Political Studies, the ISPI. Unfortunately, Michel Ndiaye with the African Union couldn't make it due to a last-minute engagement. And just a quick reminder to you viewers that you can send questions for me to ask the panelists via the Facebook page, I think, and the platform, and then I will post some of those to Yunus and Paolo. Thank you very much, Yunus and Paolo, and let me ask both of you the same question to break the ice and kickstart this. Is multilateralism still possible? It is still an asset. Does it have a future? Yunus, Paolo, who wants to start?
Yunus first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, and thanks to the Policy Center for this invitation. The question you just posed is actually quite timely, and it brings to mind the major challenges that are faced by this multilateral system in the 21st century. Whether it's relevant or not, I believe personally that it is relevant. Maybe it does not have a present today, but it definitely has a future. And allow me to list a certain number of challenges that makes it very difficult for the post-World War II international system to face these new challenges unless it reforms itself to meet these emerging challenges. The first one, of course, that comes to mind is geopolitical shifts. The current global order faces new complex challenges. There are major new tensions in the global geopolitics that we have not seen for almost a quarter century, with a rapid deterioration in, for instance, US and Russia and US-China relations. We see a new strategic shift and rapprochement between Russia and China, which for a lot of people is seen as threatening, quote unquote, the Western dominated world order. There is also the non-state actors that are becoming more and more prevalent in international arena. Beyond this classical balance of power considerations between major states, we also see non-state actors, multinational companies that are playing a major role in socioeconomic and political realms. And also we see at the security level, the armed non-state actors in the field. The issue of globalization has accelerated the dynamics and generated new demands for more effective global governance. That's why I keep saying that it is still relevant. The globalization and commodification of human life in almost all of its aspects has shown new challenges that cannot be dealt with only by single states. At the same time, I believe that globalization has unleashed dangerous new political, economic, social counterforces, which are basically sort of cocktail of nationalism, protectionism, xenophobia, that are becoming a real threat to the fabric of the current world order. There's another major challenge that we see is the lack of trust. At the end of the day, one might question we the people that is enshrined in the UN Charter. Has it really ever materialized? There's a growing mistrust between citizens and state within individual states, and subsequently in the existing international order. COVID-19 pandemic has unveiled all these issues and the mistrust that exist within the state itself and between states. There's also a major issue which I believe has to be questioned and discussed, which is the decline of the Westphalian state model, the 1648 model, which is state-centric. The multilateral system, and therefore its related institution, can it exist, can it survive when the state as such is continuously receding before the forces of the market? When the collective action is defeated by individualism, it is arguably important to question where we're heading. Collective problems, in my opinion, need collective solutions, not individual ones. That is why multilateralism has to be rekindled and strengthened. I would add to this the crisis of the global economy, which the rising inequalities. At the end of the day, a poorly performing global economy undermines the multilateral system's ability to perform effectively. For instance, these international institutions do not have any more predictable, adequate funding. There's this motto that is more and more now of doing more with less, with limited capacity to plan, prevent crises, intervene effectively when these crises arise. The world economy today is not labor intensive, so we see the world facing chronic unemployment, which is exacerbated further with the technological revolution, which today is making a large sway of the world population permanently unemployable. So this has to be also dealt with, and individual states cannot do it. There's a widespread sense of despair and hopelessness, which ultimately is leading to extremist ideology, from xenophobia to extreme forms of nationalism, proto-fascism, to violent religious extremism that we have seen for the last few years. There is also the challenge of the changing nature of armed conflicts. We have noticed hybrid warfare, non-state actors, cyber warfare, more and more intra-state violent conflicts and political instability. All this is compounded further by the demographic change. Humanity might reach by 2050, 10 billion people. So with an increased mobility, almost today, 1 billion are migrants, plus refugees due to armed conflicts, economic hardships, and climate change. More and more, we're coming back to new arms race. This time is even more dangerous than the one we've seen during the Cold War. Today's artificial intelligence arms race. There is increasing threats of diseases. That's something we can discuss later on. COVID-19 is a perfect example. And of course, climate change, which is arguably a major threat to human civilization and not individual states. And whoever thinks that we can resolve that problem by individualism is mistaken. Last but not least, technological advancement that we see today, while it offers definitely opportunities, but also it reveals that there are several threats associated to humanity. Fundamental freedoms, privacy, the body of international law, socioeconomic development. So all these challenges are actually showing the weaknesses of this multilateral system, but at the same time, in my opinion, it's showing that it is a must to have an international governance system that helps humanity meet and discuss and find solution to these collective problems.
Thank you. Again, it's massively complex, but I think you're right. I mean, there's still a role. So, Paolo, what do you think? Is still an asset, multilateralism?
Let me put it this way. Does multilateralism has a future? My answer would be yes. Will it be a rosy future? My answer is no. Because it has a future, yes, as Youssef mentioned, all the challenges we are facing, global health, inequality, climate change, economic recovery post-COVID, they are all global and they all require a global answer, which can only be provided by multilateral effort. Multilateralism is the solution, the only possible solution. But multilateralism in a divided world, in a world which is experiencing, as Youssef mentioned, a transition of power, can also be a problem. And that's why I don't expect a rosy future. The world we live, we all know, is very different from the one of a few decades ago, of 10 years ago, and existing institutions barely reflect changes. Take the IMF. The IMF is the case in point. Despite a number of reforms, the power within the organization, through quotes and voting rights, is still unevenly distributed. I come out of the G20 experience, so let me mention something on the G20. When it comes to the G20 as one of the pillars of multilateralism in particular, many complain about its effectiveness and inclusivity. But we should be aware of the trade-off between these two dimensions. Widening too much the membership and the outreach might be counterproductive, potentially creating the same difficulties that the United Nations face every day. Actually, the Italian presidency tried, as others before, to enhance the G20 inclusivity by inviting to join the table the Democratic Republic of Congo on behalf of the African Union, Rwanda on behalf of the new Partnership on Africa Development, and Brunei as rotating chair of ASEAN. This way, we try to ensure a broader representation of developing and emerging markets, particularly in the African continent, which is underrepresented at the G20, counting only on South Africa. So let me say and conclude, far from being a perfect instrument, also the G20 as an informal forum for multilateral cooperation, it has a role representing 80% of the world GDP, 75% of international trade, and 60%, around 60% of global population. It is then probably enough for the G20 to play the role of common denominator between key world powers, but each of them brings their interest, expectation, and division around the table. Maybe it's not the best option, but frankly speaking, is the only one we have today.
Thank you, Paolo. Excuse me. Let me stick to that point that you just mentioned about expectations. And let me stick to you because you were just talking about the G20 in your home country. What do you think about this very last one? I mean, it was the first in the post-Trump era. Was it a success or a flop?
Let me start with a sentence, with a tweet, which is not mine. And I'm sure Younes read it, as many others. The quote is, "I leave Rome with my hopes unfulfilled, but at least they are not buried." This is what Antonio Guterres tweeted at the end of the summit, and I think is the best synthetic assessment of the G20. A positive assessment if we consider where we come from. 4 years during Trump, in which 19 countries at the G20 used to agree to disagree with one, the US. Meetings in which trade and climate change could hardly be addressed, if even mentioned. But it's also, as Gutierrez said implicitly in his tweet, a negative assessment if we consider not where we come from, but where we need urgently to go, the final goal, a world will rapidly embrace energy transition, a world with rapidly share vaccines to end the pandemic. And if you allow me, Andres, let me be more specific on results in different areas. On global economy, the G20 was quite a success. Why? First, the global minimum tax, an unprecedented measure targeting multinationals. Second, upon request of the G20, the IMF decided for a record high 650 billion emission, new liquidity to support the post-COVID recovery. Third, the extension of the debt service suspension initiative aimed at supporting poorer and developing countries at risk. Frankly speaking, not enough to escape the fate of a new debt crisis, but still a result. Let me move to a second area, global health. Here I see more shadows on results. Equal access to vaccine has been the mantra also at the Italian presidency, but we know that reality is far away from declarations. Today's 82 countries are at risk of missing the target due to flows of COVAX, which only deliver 24% of the promised vaccine. Finally, third area, climate change. Some tend to give thumbs down as expectations were very high. The leader agreed on a shared ambition to keep global warming below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. But what was decided at the summit did not match the scope of this ambition. In particular, we were expecting, everyone, the world, was expecting the G20 to find agreement on 3 key elements: carbon neutrality by 2050, end of fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, phase out of coal by 2030. The summit only agreed to reach net zero emission by within or around the middle of the century, to take into account requests from China and India. And moreover, in the final communiqué, there is no mention to a date to end the fossil fuel subsidies or abandon coal. Still, it is wise to acknowledge that the G20 is not the right venue to set binding targets. The COP, the ongoing COP, is the right one. And to sum up, I would say that in a context of growing and persistent tension, as Youssef mentioned, we need to be realistic and admit that the G20 summit tried hard to go the extra mile in multilateral negotiation, but some still remain to be run on.
Thank you, Paolo. And as you said, it was the first after 4 years, let's say, hiatus, where like trade and climate change were nowhere in the agenda. So we can go back to the COP later. But Yunus, I mean, both of you actually spoke about this increasing fragmentation of the world order. I mean, you describe a whole ordeal that if I have to go to bed tonight, I don't want to after everything you described. But I mean, all of that fragmentation, which has implications for the international governance system, obviously, and mainly the body they work for, the UN, make me think within all of that chaos, what's viable today? What can be done in terms of governance, of an international governance? You can put it as a system, you can be a roadmap. As Paolo was saying, maybe the G20 is not a forum to discuss certain issues, but could establish certain guidelines. What can be done? What's viable?
Well, I think, I mean, I've been asked this question many times, whether this system, whether the United Nations is still relevant, how can it be fixed? There, as I explained earlier, there are complex issues to be dealt with. But we should not also forget that people have the tendency to take things for granted, because this system, for the 76 years that it has lived on, has achieved a lot, whether we notice it or not. Let me give you examples, for instance. It has helped avoid a third world war, post-1945. It has developed for the first time a body of international legal norms that amass considerable, maybe not comprehensive, international law, rules, norms, which member states have adopted for the last 76 years. It managed to put in place a system of international dispute settlement mechanisms. The UN, the body that I work for, is the center of this. It has also seen the evolution of a number of important judicial arbitral mechanisms to settle international disputes in a peaceful way. There are a number or large network of international regulatory institutions and specialized agencies that, from WTO, from WHO to UNICEF and others, that are providing major help to people in need, managing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Now that we see the discussions and negotiations between the US, the EU, and Iran in terms of peace and security, and despite all the shortcomings of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Atomic Energy Agency, they still perform a critical role in preventing an all-out proliferation of nuclear weapons. It has to be, of course, reformed, and let's say a grain of equality should be put into the system, but yet it is still performing, it has performed some important roles so far. The peacekeeping missions that the UN has completed since its creation, almost 54 peacekeeping missions. Today there's much less, 16, I believe. The promotion of human rights, which a lot of people take for granted today. I mean, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant on Social and Economic and Cultural Rights are important legal instruments. The fact that the work that the UN on protecting biodiversity, I mentioned here, for example, the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity, the work on climate change, what Paolo just referred to. All this are extremely important. Yet, and I argue and I confess that the UN and this system is ill-equipped to meet these emerging challenges. For one, for instance, the fact that the idea of multilateral system of which the UN is the principal body, it is more relevant than before, but the institutional arrangements that have, in my opinion, have become antiquated with time. For instance, the world today is completely different from the world post-1945, where most members of the UN were not independent then. And these developing countries, the way we call them today, or countries or states of the south of our globe, are asking for more voice in the decision-making process, more role, more equality in this. So, for instance, one of the things that should be done to fix the system is to revisit the decision-making process and mechanisms to reflect the reality of today's world. A more democratic system is in order. The global context, as I said, is very different. For instance, the issue of United Nations Security Council versus the General Assembly. The resolution of the Security Council are legally binding, while those of the General Assembly are not. And it should be, in my opinion, the opposite, because the GA is the larger, a more democratic body where these decisions could be made. The issue of the veto power. There have been discussions for over 2 decades within the halls of the UN to fix this issue, but still, it's a problem. There is also things related to the way we deal with the different challenges. The 3 pillars of the UN: peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights, should be dealt with more and more in a holistic way, in a way that they are connected, not in a silo way that has been done so far. And after all, the type of challenges we see today, that we face today, even though there's skepticism whether this international system, the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions are capable of facing them, I don't think we have a choice. And here I echo what Paolo said. Issues like climate change, which are complex and transboundary, can never be resolved without a multilateral approach. And here I would recall what Winston Churchill said once about the limitation of the democratic system. It is said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms. I would say the same thing for the UN. We cannot replace it today, because I'm in the current context where we see this individualism rising. I don't see the member state today, if we had to get rid of the current governance systems at the global level, if they would agree easily on a new charter, on a new international system. This opportunity might arise in the future, but until then, we will live in this twilight zone that creates more problem than solutions. And since we talked about Rome and Paolo is Italian, I'd like to state what Antonio Gramsci stated in 1930, that the old system is dying and the new one cannot be born. In this twilight or interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And those morbid symptoms are actually what I referred to earlier: nationalism, individualism, xenophobia, and even proto-fascism that we see in a lot of countries. And in my opinion, and I'm a firm believer in this, if the system does not have a present today, a rosy present, I believe it will have a future. And here I would disagree with Paolo. I see the future, of course, the road to that future very problematic and not rosy at all. But I believe that we'll end up returning to some form of multilateralism sooner or later, and sooner will be better.
Thank you.
Can I? No, this is my hope as well, of course. But I think I will make a couple of comments, Andres, which will not allow you to go to sleep tonight as relaxed as you wish. But where are you right now?
I'm in Nairobi.
In Nairobi, so it's, we have the same time zone, so you will go to bed when I go to bed. No, reacting to what Youssef said, my concern, and that's why I said I don't expect a rosy future, but I do expect a future, and I do hope there is a future. My concern are, on one side, Youssef mentioned universal declaration of human rights, the UN as a universal body, and is built up on universal values. And I believe we are now watching, experiencing, and we will increasingly experience doubt on the very existence of universal values. Some countries, many countries, always had doubts on the existence of universal values. But some of these countries were not even existing when the UN was created. They were colonies. Some, and I mean the Soviet Union, for many years were extremely isolated. And others, mainly China and others, were for many decades too weak to react and to counter the universal values that the Western has presented and imposed to the world. And when we mention the shift of power, the emergence of the existence, not emergence, of new relevant actors in the international arena, we mean that countries who see universal values, who see capitalism, who see democracy, who see human rights in a different way, are now relevant. They are sitting around the table, in some cases at the UN, or they are rightly pretending to have a seat in table in which they feel they are underrepresented. And this is one issue. The second issue, and I totally agree with Younes, there is a need to revisit the system, not only the UN, the entire architecture was created in the 50s. And it's sad to notice that the only new rekindled institution is, in a sense, the G20, which moved from G7 to G8, then to G7, then to G20. All the other adjustments, as the one Youssef mentioned, revisiting the Security Council, revisiting and rebalancing the power of the Security Council versus the General Assembly, are extremely, extremely difficult to implement. I teach United Nations at the university, and I always go, when I deal with this issue, I go to my student with, on one hand, the tiny chart, UN chart, which is the blue book, which is 20-page, tiny, extremely tiny. And on the other hand, I present them a book which was edited 3 years ago, 3 volumes, a red book like this, on UN reform, which means to reform a tiny chart. We have written over the last decades all the reform proposal, an encyclopedia. So, and why did we write an encyclopedia? Because countries which have a veto power do not allow any change. We are all familiar with that. You know, when there was the idea to have one Latin America country, I'm referring to you, Andres, there was a fight between Brazil and Argentina and everything got parado, stopped. Then the idea to include Germany came up and Italy did its best to stop it, parado again. And the same goes on in Africa and so on. So a lot of convergence issues do not allow reforms with the speed we want. Take the IMF. I mentioned the IMF before. It clearly needs to be reformed, but the reform of the IMF means less power for the United States, more power for the other. Less power for Europe, more power for the other. And those who are sitting there don't want to lose their power. It's again, a future, yes, an easy future. Let's put it this way, UNEF. I will not say I don't see a rosy future. I don't see an easy future. That could be a compromise.
Well, yes. I don't know if you allow me to quickly say something. I think we say the same thing. I think we agree. The issue is the issue of power. Like any change, whether it's at the international level, whether it's at the national level, it is always perceived as winner and losers. And I think we probably should. It's about time that we change our mentality, the way we view the distribution of power. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We have to enlarge the horizon of the possible. And I believe we can think outside of the set norms. Maybe we should not have an architecture that has Security Council, GA, and the veto instead of enlarging it to others. Maybe, but this kind of questions should be freely debated more and more instead of just thinking within the set boundaries of post-1945 world order.
But I think, Yunus, let me build on that, because you mentioned power, and from the layman's perspective, there's always a mistrust in power. So what sort of like role can we entrust these international institutions, any international institution, in sort of like rebuilding a new world order? And how can those institutions build or rebuild, depending, a sense of trust in themselves, in these organizations?
Well, it's a quite challenging task. I agree with you. It's not easy because power is diluted and diffused, and those who have it do not like to share it. I mean, this is almost a human trait, unfortunately. We see what's happening at the international level, happening within states today. You see, the COVID-19 has unveiled this. Why do we see people mistrusting the instructions and recommendations of governments, from confinement to vaccines, for instance? It's not about vaccines per se, in my opinion. It is because the liberal order, the democracy as such, has not fulfilled the promises for the majority of people. Like the economic system has not provided for the majority. It has provided for a smaller and smaller elite, and this elite is shrinking by the day. And unfortunately, the way we're heading, if we do not stop and reflect and try to change this course, we'll end up having a majority left on the side. And this majority, if it's silent today, will not be silent tomorrow. So again, to rebuild trust, I do not think that those who have the power will just do it by themselves because they just awakened to a morality that they didn't have. I think it's an issue of balance of power. That's what the human history has showed us. but it's also the fact, I think, that while I discussed technology earlier, I mentioned briefly that it has opportunities, but it also has challenges. I think one of the opportunities is that it has made things more transparent than before. More people now realize what's happening around the world than 50 years ago. So this illiteracy that existed so far in terms of international architecture, international politics, is less and less by the day. But then, how do we rekindle people's belief in politics, in the sense not of political behavior, but politics in the sense, how do we live collectively? How do we manage the affairs of the city? That is what is important. And people have to awaken to this, because I always say, if you're not interested in politics, politics is interested in you.
Thank you, Yunus. Yes.
Can I, because Andres, you asked a few minutes ago, can international institution, organization help shape the new world order? I'm afraid, and I don't want to take too much a hyper-realistic approach, but I would say that we have learned that international organization reflects new world order more than shape a new world order. So when there is after a war or after some kind of clarification, a new and clear balance of power, this is when international organizations are reshaped and reflected. But what we are experiencing versus the 1945 is that there is no war, and luckily so, and so we are in the middle. So there is no clear winner, no clear loser, and no clear power in charge of redesigning. So what is the possible outlook? If there is no change, this may lead China and others to look for alternative formats, as they feel they are not fairly represented in the existing ones. And there are already plenty of examples. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with more than 100 member states, but take also brand new trade agreements, such as the RCEP, that see China playing a pivotal role. Or move to the security field. China is clearly pursuing parallel routes to the G20. President Xi Jinping did not attend the extraordinary G20 meeting on Afghanistan and promoted a discussion in the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And Russia is doing the same with the so-called Moscow format. So the risk we are facing, not having a war, luckily so, not having a clear winner or loser, is that we could see a proliferation of alternative organization, which is typical in this field. I mean, you do not close down something which is not performing anymore. It's very complicated. You just add something and you dilute responsibility, and this is the risk I see, because what is clear is that this would not represent a multilateral global exercise. This would be some kind of regionalization of issues, which in some area, take trade, could be positive in the short run, but in other areas, take security or human rights, it's clearly not the objective and the final output we all expect. Yunus, we are in a G0 world. We have no moderator.
Okay. So I mean, I would just point out to two things that you just said, Paolo. That this is quite important that you mentioned it. At the end of the day, the UN or the international order are just a reflection of the balance of power. And sometimes when I hear the criticism about the UN, it did not do this, it didn't do that, I always try to remind people that the UN or any other international organization is only a reflection of what balance of power that exists between member states. It is not a supranational institution that decides for others. It does not have sovereignty per se. It does not have teeth. It does not have an army. It does not even have its own financial system that allows it to be financially independent. And you said rightly so that if this system does not reform itself to reflect the new context of the world today and involve more of those who perceive themselves as having been marginalized by the post-1945 world order, they will forsake this system. They will leave and create something different. And we can already see this, for instance, the way the funding of major organizations around the world, and the UN in particular, is dwindling by the day and makes it even harder for the UN to meet these new challenges.
Youssef, in this anarchic world, which we do represent having no moderator for technical reason, we take the lead and we continue. At this point, we were supposed to exchange views on one issue that Andres should have raised. And the issue was that did the pandemic boosted or retrained? Andres, I was playing your role, but I'm glad you step in. We were discussing, I was anticipating your question on the effect on the pandemic on multilateralism, boosting or restraining. And so now you can step in.
I mean, sorry, I lost you for something happened.
No, we understood, and we try to manage in the G0 world without a leader. Let's have Younes first.
Well, regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, it was a perfect example and test to the system. And it's obviously, we all failed. I mean, you cannot say it otherwise. It has shown how states around the world are unwilling, and especially powerful states are unwilling to act in solidarity, to share vaccines, to help each other. And unfortunately, this is, in my opinion, a post-1990 mentality that is mostly individualistic, profit-driven, market-based, not institutional-based. And I refer to what I said earlier. Can we exist as a multilateral system when based on the state as such? Can it exist when the state itself is receding in most parts of the world? Where you have multinationals much stronger financially and more powerful than a lot of states. This is the major question we have to ask ourselves. And and at the end of the day, as COVID-19 showed, whether you're rich or powerful or you're poor, you would not be able to manage it by yourself. I mean, you can vaccinate all your population, and if the rest of the world is not vaccinated, you cannot protect yourself. You can build borders and walls, it will not help. Ultimately, you will be affected because viruses like climate change does not recognize borders. So instead of building walls, we should start building bridges. And that's why I said we need a value shift, a way of thinking that is completely different. And we should take the COVID-19 crisis as a good opportunity to rethink the way our civilization is working or not working probably, and how we could rethink of a world, in my opinion, based on solidarity, not on competition. And for me, the formula is very simple. The question is very simple. If we agree on this basic principle, then we can find ways of developing and unfold this new world order. Do we want a world that is based on harsh, almost savage competition, profit-driven, some sort of social Darwinism, or we want a world order that is based on solidarity and common destiny of humanity? If we answer this question and we know where we stand on this very fundamental existential question, I think we can develop either this or that. And as long as we don't know where we stand on this very basic question, I think we will have to face more and more issues and problems.
But it's a question of willingness. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we all thought the world has come to terms with the fact that sometimes not very much thought that actually we are linked in this sort of like chain of humanity. But I mean, Paolo was mentioning, that COVAX only managed 24% of its goal. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 5 or 6% of the population in Africa is vaccinated versus a much bigger share in the developing world. So, Paolo, what do you think? Boosting or retrenching thanks to the pandemic?
It boosted the need for multilateralism, but weakened the capability to perform and to address and to reply with timely action. It boosted the need because we have been repeating in all countries, we get out together or we do not get out of this crisis. We have been repeating it within our countries when we had different trend of the pandemic. And so in Italy, for example, we had a crisis in the north and then nothing in the south. And we were saying we are interconnected. It will come sooner or later, and we have to work on the entire country to avoid the spread of the virus. And then this applied in Europe when European countries were looking at Italy, which was the hotspot, and we were saying it's by chance that it's here, it will come to you soon. We have to do something together, and then from Europe to the rest of the world. So we have learned step by step that we are all interconnected. And this is one of the most global crises we have experienced. We have been discussing for years in Europe migration or terrorism, but this was not a global emergency. If it were a global emergency, it had very different perception in different countries of the world. It had a meaning from African country, losing people, for transit country, an opportunity to make money, or for destination country, a challenge to welcome many people. So this was really global. At the same time, the entire world, with the health crisis, an economic crisis, and a social crisis. But then it weakened our capability to address the issue through a multilateral approach, because during the worst crisis in a century that many countries have experienced, the famous "my country first" approach, which we were blaming to Trump, has been adopted by everyone. At the beginning it was my mask, then it was my ventilators, then my vaccine, my capability to spend money and to make debt to boost the economy. So every country put my country first at the center of their policy. And the main reason, and I go back to what Youssef and myself said before, is that this global crisis is happening at a time in which we are experiencing a big transition of power from Western to Asia, from United States to China. And so everyone was playing a very careful role. The issue was winning and not losing the big transition, not to give the other an opportunity to increase its chance to win the big game, the big competition. So this is the reality.
I think that's my, Paolo, if I may stick to you, that's the next question, because the big elephant in the room in this whole conversation has been China. So with the emergence, predominance even of China in this new world order, is this the end of the Western world order, or what are we, or is like tectonic plagues like shifting and reaccommodating?
But it's clearly a change in the Western-dominated world we have all grown up with, clearly. And it's the first real challenge, because Soviet Union was a challenge, of course, we tend to forget that, but was completely different. It was a security challenge, an ideological challenge, but it was not a cultural or economic challenge. Soviet Union was nothing compared with China today. So, and as mentioned previously, the big issue is that China, Russia, and others are joining up now. This was totally unexpected and foreseeable 20 years ago. Russia would hardly have considered any kind of alliance with China 20 years ago. But now, for different reasons, tactical, more than strategical, we are in a sense pushing Russia in the hands of China, because that's clearly the case. It's in the end, because one is much bigger and powerful than the other, and other countries may join in. It was interesting, you know, Andres, both Putin and Xi were not attending the G20 in Rome for different reasons, but also Mohammed bin Salman did not attend from Saudi Arabia. And one explanation which was circulating was that he was not attending because Russia and China were not. And which, of course, Youssef knows much better than me that we, within the UN, the UN has already experienced the non-aligned movement. But this is something completely different. The non-aligned movement was a group of most poor and weak countries which were saying this is not the UN we want. We are hoping in something different. The UN we are facing is still made up with former colonial power. We see the same face around, okay? Bandung and what followed that. This time is slightly different because we have alarm sign coming from the second largest economy in the world, the largest China, the largest fossil producer, Russia, the third country could be Saudi Arabia, which is extremely powerful in this. And this come at a time in which we are discussing an energy transition. So you have on the other side of the table the biggest consumer of fossil and the two largest producer of fossil, which while we discuss energy transition, retreat saying, okay, hold on a second, let's see what's going on.
Thank you, Paolo. Yunus?
Yeah, well, I do agree generally with what Paolo said, but there is an important caveat I would put to this, is that today the difference, the shift between of power from west to east and from the US to China, while it is happening, it is not, in my opinion, offering a new alternative. We are not in the situation of the Cold War. We had two different ways of seeing the world, two different social and economic and political systems. Here, it is a competition between two types of nationalisms. I mean, I don't see China, even if I hear the adjective communist China tagged to its name, I mean, it's laughable. I don't see China as a communist country. I mean, if you go to, it's better for a powerful and billionaire to go die in China because his offspring will only pay 13% inheritance taxes, which is much lower than most of the Western countries, and especially the United States. And the governance system, the political governance system of China, in my opinion, and I believe in most people who believe in freedoms, is not very particularly attractive. Now we should give it to China that it has really achieved a miracle from in what, maybe 25 years, to move millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But it remains to be seen whether this will continue in the future or not. What I would argue is, it is true, it's time that we rethink the power balance between states around the world. And it is fair to say that this system has been dominated by a group at the expense of others. And it's only fair that they think they should change the rules of the game. But to move from one domination to another is not a solution. Two wrongs don't make a right. So for me, until today, that's why we see this chaotic way of dealing with politics, both nationally and internationally, is because we do have changes, and very fast changes that we see today, but we don't have yet an alternative. And I believe until we have a new alternative that perceives development as an instrument for human growth, for human prosperity, and not vice versa. Humans are not there to serve the economy, but the economy to serve the people. Until we have a new way of implementing democratic ideals, until we see the world as something that we share in common between all the people of the planet, and also in solidarity with the future generation. Until we see that, I don't see an alternative, whether the power moves from west to east or north to south, and if we still have the same way of doing business as usual, I think it's not a big deal at the end of the day. It's not really a change in my opinion.
Yunus, let me stick to you, because you said this idea of who's relevant, but in a way, I mean, but how can the UN remain relevant? I mean, with all these challenges we discussed today, I mean, I'm thinking, I mean, I cover Ethiopia, I've been to Tigray, and I may think it's a headache for the UN system, the current conflict in Ethiopia, from the humanitarian perspective, all the hurdles that the UN has gone through, and from that higher policy-making level, like the warring parties not being willing to sit down and talk. So how can the UN now sort of like, I don't know if reinvent itself, but how can the UN sort of like remain relevant when these challenges like this civil war in Ethiopia, or as you said, migration, refugee crisis, how can it still be the one you said, okay, you know what, we may criticize this, but let's find the north there at the UN?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point that you raised here. Well, first of all, let's make things clear. The UN is not a supranational entity that exists outside of the balance of power. And as Paulo earlier stated, and I agree with him, it's a reflection of the balance of power. Mm-hmm. The UN will only be relevant if member states want it to be relevant. If they don't, it will be irrelevant. And unfortunately, what we have seen for many years now, and we've saw a lot of conflicts, especially in the Eastern North Africa since 2011, and we will see increasing conflicts around the world. We saw that the role of the UN has been marginalized. Look at its role in Syria, look at its role in Afghanistan, look at its role in the issue in Libya. Of course, it is in the forefront of this, but actually the dynamics behind the scene is not favoring a full control of the UN. So I think one of the fundamentals and sine qua non conditions for the UN to become relevant and stay relevant, and in my opinion, it has to be relevant because there's only a collective solution to these kind of problems. For it to be relevant, it has to come from member states, and member states need to recommit again that they want to work together. They believe in the multilateral system, that they really see it as an added value. Unfortunately, that's what I said earlier, that the system does not have a present, maybe it has a future. Most countries do not see that, and it's a vicious circle. When people do not see that it is relevant and they don't understand why it has become irrelevant, they take it for granted that it is relevant and it is useless. And that will ultimately weakens the system even further. In my opinion, and this I'm saying it, I mean, in all honesty, it's not because I work for this institution. I believe a world without the UN would be tenfold worse than a world with the UN?
Tenfold worse. That means I'm definitely not going to sleep tonight. Paolo, any comments on that before we wrap up?
No, I tend to agree. The risk for the present, let me stick to what Youssef said. I don't see a present, but I do see a future. The risk for the present is for the UN to become a sort of large Red Cross, an organization which member states go to and ask to step in when no one else wants to step in. So mainly humanitarian assistance, and not in preventing or addressing security crisis. Youssef was rightly mentioning that the UN is in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, is involved, but the game is played by external actors. Call it Astana process, call it Moscow process, call it whatever you like. It is clear that a divided world, a world in which the Security Council, as we should not forget that, as it was for a few decades during the Cold War, is not able to address any issue relevantly because either Russia or China, or Russia and China, or United States on the other side veto any decision. So you externalize the security issue to subgrouping, and you are asked, take Afghanistan, to step in to provide humanitarian assistance, which is extremely relevant. Let's keep that in mind. The role the UN is playing in Afghanistan, being the only organization acting and knowing the country, is crucial. But this is clearly not the original role the UN was created for. We lost.
That is true. I don't know if Andres is still
in an anarchic world, G0 world.
Well, Paolo, I think we're in agreement here. Overall, I believe the multilateral system has to reinvent itself through a global collective effort, which should stem, in my opinion, from the essential principles of, on the one hand, solidarity, on the other, equality. It is the sine qua non conditions, in my opinion, for that multilateral system and global governance architecture to have a future. And short of that, I think the threat is that humanity itself would probably not have a future if we continue down this road.
Thank you. Sorry, I lost you again. There was one question. How does the reform of the UN, particularly the Security Council and the General Assembly, and strengthen multilateralism?
That's for Youssef.
Okay. Well, I think what Paolo said earlier, when people do not see, when member states do not see themselves represented in this system, that they don't have a voice, that the agenda is driven by a group of countries at the expense of others, they will lose faith, and they have already lost faith in that system. So they've been trying to fix it. And until we fix this, I think we will still be having a lot of people that are skeptical about the way it functions and the way it represents the different voices of member states around the world. I'm not in favor. I don't think it's possible today to discard all what has been achieved since 1945 and create something new. Because if we can't agree on reform in a few things, I don't think we can agree on new constitutional order around the world, a new charter. Those 20 pages, I think if we have to discuss them and negotiate them today, I don't think we will be able to agree until we're faced with something with the major odds and catastrophes. Then people would just wake up and say, enough is enough. So I still believe that then efforts should continue to push for changes from within the system, but it is not enough. The system cannot regulate and reform itself by itself. It has to come from powers from outside. And I think the voices of people, because at the end of the day, the Charter of the United Nations starts "we the people." It does not say "we the government," it's not "we the states." So people need to realize that we have something in common, and they have to push the individual states to commit further towards this. I know it may sound idealistic, utopian, but I think without dreams, we wouldn't have achieved so much in human civilization.
Youssef, you are echoing Wilson, and Wilson was labeled as idealistic. You are right. So stricto sensu. No, we have on this approach, the one you mentioned, let's see what happens on climate, because that's a trial, an important
test, yes.
We are clearly seeing a world population, the we that you mentioned, increasingly asking for further steps, maybe because nobody is aware of what the energy transition implies for everyone, but it's clearly Greta and beyond, it's clearly coming, it's one of the strongest voices coming from the united world of people. And let's see how the international organization system, meaning the G20 first and COP now, reacts to that. If this momentum proves to be successful and shows positive results, I would be positive, and Andres could go to bed tonight more relaxed. If not, I would doubt the same process would apply to the UN in general. But I agree with you. Only mentioning the idea, and I'm replying to other questions that I see in the chat, the idea of revising the UN Charter or reforming the Security Council would open up an incredible Pandora box, which would not lead anywhere, which would imply a waste of years, which would open up larger fights on other issues, because when you open up a discussion on the Charter, you can start, for example, debating on universal values or universal human rights, which are not stricto sensu in the Charter, but were referred to in Universal Declaration. So, you know, it's like in Europe. Let me stop and conclude with the experience of Europe. We have in Europe the same issue. All foreign policy decisions are taken with unanimity, which means every country has a veto power. And we have been discussing the fact that this system proves very inefficient. But if we try to open up a discussion with new European treaty in the past, and we experienced that mentioning treaty revision is an incredible Pandora box. So what we did after that was, as Youssef mentioned, to try to revise and amend what we do without changing the chart, without changing, in our case, the treaty. This is what we did, by the way, with the European Recovery Fund, with the European bonds. I mean, it could have been, should have been included in a chart, in a treaty, but we found a creative way to move on in spite of, without changing. So this could be the way. It won't be easy, it will be difficult, and that's why I said not a really rosy future, but a future for sure.
I mean, I think I'm going to still have sleepless nights, but I'm still living it with a dash of optimism. As you say, Eunice, it's we the people, and I think that should apply to all of the multilateral institutions and bodies, which then it's a reflection of the ballot boxes in each country, those who have them. So thank you very much, Paolo and Eunice. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the Policy Center once again. Stay tuned, as there's much more Atlantic dialogues to come, and I hope to see you all in Marrakesh next year. And courage. The world is a dangerous place, but it's still a fascinating one and the only one we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.